is Chukat, which is basically Numbers 18, 19, 20, 21. I don't think I have it all on there. I don't remember the exact chapters. And there's lots of stuff that's going on. Did you hit the button? Lots of stuff that's going on with this Torah portion, and it was kind of an easy decision, really, for me to pick a topic in order to share with you. And it's because I believe it's an important one. And most of you that have been here by now should know that every time I teach anything from the Torah portion is I'm going to link it to your identity, and I'm going to link it to Yeshua every single time, hopefully. That I'll be able to make some sort of connection in some sort of way to establish the foundation of who Yeshua is and who he is as our Messiah. So today, I've basically picked the whole bronze serpent on the pole thing, which is kind of why I had Melanie go buy me this snake yesterday. It ought to be just a kind of a cool visual. I'm not going to go around and touch people with it or ask you to dance with it or anything like that. If some of you don't know what that is, look it up on your own time. We're not going to talk about it. But anyway, I wanted to be able to talk to you about what exactly was happening in this Torah portion, why Moshe, had everybody look at this bronze serpent on this pole. We're going to give you a little bit of context, a little bit of history to bronze serpents and dual symbolism of things that were actually happening in the ancient Near East. Most of you should know by now that I teach on ancient Near Eastern, first century context and all of these things so we can understand the Bible the way that it's supposed to be intended. I don't like to harp a lot on the paganism side of things. We're all aware that all of the nations surrounding Israel did lots and lots of bad things. If you want to learn about paganism, you can just jump on any website, on the internet, Facebook. You can learn all about the paganism you want. Okay? We understand that. But I want to be able to present some of the historical context to these things so we can see why these things are happening in the Torah, throughout the Tanakh, and throughout the first century writings. Okay? It doesn't mean necessarily that Yahweh is using something pagan. Remember what I've said in the past, is he's always going to show you a distinction. There's always something else that we need to look at. Even though some of these nations were having the same type of commandments, the same type of laws, the same type of symbolism, it doesn't mean that there was the same exact meaning. There's always a distinction. Okay? And a lot of people who start studying ancient Near Eastern context, they end up being what's called as a minimalist. Have you ever heard the word minimalist before? You know what that is? They start looking at the ancient Near East and all of these ancient documents and these other things that the nations were doing, and they're saying, well, this is no different than what these people were doing, so the Bible can't be true. So then they come to the conclusion that they need to walk away from the Bible because they can't figure out the distinction. Okay? So whenever you're studying this stuff, you've got to make sure that you are not looking at it from that perspective to say, well, this is no different than what the nations were doing. Well, some to an extent, maybe not, but there is that small, minute distinction that Yahweh is using because this is the way that they understood things. This is their culture. This is their language. This is their idiomatic expressions. This is their concepts that these kingdoms were built upon. Okay? So, basically, I've labeled this teaching called the Pole of Liberation. And we're going to make some really interesting connections to this, at least I hope. And the very first thing that most of you should already know at this point, why is this not changing? Hold on a second, guys. One of the very first pictures that we all should be recognizing is that this is indeed a shadow picture of Yeshua, right? And we're going to talk about why that is, and we're going to talk about some of the legality of the stuff that is attached to that. There we go. Now we're working. So let's go ahead. I'm going to read the actual verses of the stuff that we're talking about. Probably not very good for you guys to see, but I'm going to read these verses, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of the historical context to show you the symbolism that was going on not only in ancient Egypt, but some of the other nations, and then we're going to talk about some other good stuff. So the verses are Numbers 21, 1 through 9, and this is why I found extremely interesting about the position that I was given during the tribulation game, is because I had no idea what the trib game theme was. I didn't know what verses they were going to use. Man, we knocked the snake over. That can't be a good sign. Well, I had no idea what the theme was going to be, or any of that stuff. I didn't even know what position they gave me. And then I ended up finding out in the staff meeting that I was going to be with Charlton, Heston, and Monty that was giving out the bronze serpent card. So I found it really interesting because I had already had this teaching prepared before I went there. So the verses are Numbers 21, verses 1 through 9. And the sovereign of Arad, the Canaanites, who dwelt in the south, heard that Israel was coming on the way to Atharim. And he fought against Israel and took some of them captive. Then Israel made a vow to Yahweh and said, if you deliver this people into my hand, indeed, then I shall put their cities under the ban. And Yahweh listened to the voice of Israel and gave up the Canaanites, and they put them and their cities under the ban. So the name of that place was called Hormah. Verse 4, and they departed from Mount Hor by the way of the Sea of Reeds to go around the land of Edom. But the being of the people grew impatient because of the way. Imagine that, they're complaining again. And the people spoke against Elohim and against Moshe. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and our being loathes this light bread. And Yahweh sent fiery serpents among them, and they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. Then the people came to Moshe and said, we have sinned, for we have spoken against Yah and against you. Pray to Yahweh to take away the serpents from us. So Moshe prayed on behalf of the people. And Yahweh said to Moshe, make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and it shall be that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, shall live. So Moshe made a bronze serpent and put it on a pole, and it came to be, if a serpent had bitten anyone, when he looked at the bronze serpent, he lived. So now you see why they came up with the card and the station of the game. And the kids could not figure out Numbers 21:9. Well, what do we need? What do we need? We need wood and you need bronze. And then the way you can make this.
I got it eventually.
Yes, you did, son.
Eventually.
Easy, guys. All right, so basically I want to show you some dual symbolism because there is a lot of symbolism in the ancient Near East that has double meanings. Even though it may look like it is completely distinct or they're completely opposites, there is a dual symbolism, okay? And we're going to talk a lot about that. But those verses that we just, I want to go back to that. Those verses we just read, Numbers 21, they're complaining about, there not being any food, not any water, and all this other. Mind you, this is already after the fact that they've been sentenced to wilderness prison for the next 40 years. I mean, you'd think you would have a clue of what's going on. So there's all this consistent whining throughout the book of Numbers. And here's another one, Numbers 11, verses 1 through 6. And it came to be when the people were as complainers, it was evil in the ears of Yahweh, and Yahweh heard it, and his displeasure burned, and the fire of Yahweh burned among them, and consumed those on the outskirts of the camp. And the people cried out to Moshe, and Moshe prayed to Yah, and the fire died down. Then he called the name of the place Taberah, because the fire of Yah had burned among them. And the mixed multitude who were in their midst lusted greatly, so the children of Israel also wept again, and said, who is giving us meat to eat? We remember the fish in which we ate without cost in Egypt. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, and the onions, and the garlic. But now our throat is dried up. There is not to look at but this manna. So they're complaining about this food. So what I'm showing you here is this constant complaining and desire for them to go back to Egypt. Okay? And why is that? Well, because they recognize all of these things and all these blessings that they had in Egypt, but they forgot that they were actually slaves, and that they cried out to the Creator for Him to come and deliver them, to liberate them, to establish them back again as a people. So they go out and they have a little bit of hardship, and they start complaining and whining about going back to Egypt. 1 second. Yeah, this is one thing I want to make mention of. This is not to mention the rebellions of Miriam and Aaron against Moshe, the 10 spies' evil report of the land granted, or Korah's rebellion. So they're whining about all these other things, but I mean, this isn't even talking about the constant rebellion that they had. The 10 spies incident, Miriam, Korah, all of these people that spoke against Moshe, they spoke against Yahweh, they did all these things, and they're still whining about going back to Egypt. Another verse, Numbers 14, 1 through 7, and I'll just skip to read the one verse and that's highlighted in yellow. And they said to each other, let us appoint a leader and let us turn back to Egypt. Wanting to go back to Egypt there again. Another one, Numbers 21, 1 through 5, verse 5, and why have you brought us up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. Okay, this is already immediately right after the 10 spies incident. So the generation is going to die in there. So, okay, if we're going to die in the wilderness, let's just continue to complain, see if we can go back. Doesn't make any sense. So, the image of the serpent. Let's talk about serpent symbols and salvation. This is going to show you why they're complaining about going back to Egypt, because they're remembering all of these things that they dealt with in the land of Egypt and how their kingdom was established. This is from an article called Serpent Symbols and Salvation. It's actually from a Mormon. So if you find this article or you want this article, I will give it to you. But just remember, it's from a Mormon. We don't agree with any of the stuff attached to that. Okay, I got it because some of these historical documents that we use in these articles, they're written from Christian scholars, Mormon scholars, rabbinical scholars, and all that kind of stuff. So you take the good stuff, you take the context, the archaeology, the context to all of these things that happen within their cultures, and you throw the rest away. Okay, you guys have been in this long enough to understand that. I shouldn't have to give a disclaimer every time I share a resource. So it says, the image of the serpent was tremendously significant in the ancient world. Societies and scriptures of the Near East simultaneously attributed two highly symbolic roles to serpents. One role connected serpents to the heavens by having them represent deity, creative powers, and healing. The other linked them with the underworld and associated them with evil, harm, and destructive influences. We who live in modern times have no difficulty appreciating this double symbol because, in fact, this duality persists in our own day. The symbol of the healing serpent appears on the physician's catechus. I didn't even realize the word was in there. Me and Chris were talking about this before. He's like, you know what the catechus is? I'm like, I thought it was something Catholic.
Catechus?
He goes, yeah, that's why I thought it was the catechism, but then he was saying about what this is. And I was like, oh, I think I just have the English word in there. I don't have the Latin word, but now I guess I have the Latin word. Anyway, while a person of disreputable actions, especially treachery, is sometimes referred to as a snake. So what does this mean? As we come into the Hebrew roots movement, we attach all this pagan stuff to all these different things, all these different symbols. You know, and my wife comes from the medical field. How many, is anybody here in the medical field? Okay. So you know about this symbol and all this stuff with the two snakes and the pole and all that kind of stuff. It's directly linked back to this mentality to where the ancient gods, they would attach a snake to being some sort of creator or some sort of healer and all this other stuff. It goes back to this actually scripture in Numbers 21 like we're seeing here. Yes, it has some paganism attached to it, but that's not the whole medical world's evil way of trying to get you to submit to paganism by having this symbol. It has a meaning, and they take the meaning from these verses in Scripture and some of the other deities and kingdoms that actually used it. Okay? Now, hopefully you're beginning to see a little bit of the dual symbolism because it's representing life on one hand, but then on the other hand, it's representing a serpent or a snake in the underworld. So it has dual symbolism. One represents life, and one represents death. Okay, what's the very first thing that we see in Genesis? We have a serpent. Does that serpent represent life? No, doesn't represent life. What does this one? This snake represents life. So there's dual symbolism there because anybody that looked upon the snake on the pole, they were healed instantly from the fiery serpents, which, hello, there's two right there. So you have fiery serpents that are getting bit by that are killing them, which represents death. But anyone who looked upon the bronze serpent on the pole presented by Moshe was granted life. So you have dual symbolism for the same creature. Does it make sense so far? Okay. Anybody ever seen this before? Nobody? I've never seen this before until I put this together last week. This is an actual monument on Mount Nebo in the wilderness that they created with the brazen serpent on it. And this thing looks like it's probably 30 foot, 35 foot tall. Just to give you a little bit of a visual so you can see what... And I don't think the one that Moshe made was this big by any means. I think it was probably a little bit closer to that, maybe a little bit taller. With, you know... But just to give you a little bit of a visual. All right, Egyptian evidence of the dual symbolism. The serpent as a dual polar symbol emerged in the cradle of civilization during the earliest periods of history. Serpent symbolism among the ancient Egyptians demonstrates the most glaring contrast between worship on the one hand and abhorrence on the other. In Egypt, the snake was a chthonic animal, a creature representing any one of a number of the gods of the earth and underworld, and the embodiment of life-giving powers. Attributing life-giving powers to snakes may have arisen in part from observing snakes shielding through shedding their skins, continually exposing a new body in the process. Thus, one of the forms of the god Atum, believed to be a primordial creator deity, was a snake or serpent that continued to live season after season. So this is one of the gods in Egypt. That's all I'm giving you. I think I have 3 in here. I'll give you 3 gods in Egypt that the snake was a part of that deity's symbolism. Okay? And this, I guess I don't really know a whole lot about the whole baptism, dancing with snakes things. I mean, maybe if I did, maybe this is where they get it, is they think that they're healing themselves or something. I don't get it, but it seems kind of strange to me. Veneration of serpents or snakes. In pre-dynastic Egypt and during the Old Kingdom, coalesced around the most important serpent goddess of Lower Egypt, Wajit. Wajit, meaning green one, was the general Egyptian term for cobra, and in that form she became the symbol of royalty and unification. In fact, the cobra or uraeus became a generic Egyptian ideograph for the concept of immorality. So basically what that means is you can see the cobra was on the headgear, so it represented Wajit, this goddess. In opposition, that was all that was good in Egypt. So I gave you 2 that represented life, and then there's going to be this one that represents death. To all that was good in ancient Egypt, the most preeminent of all demons, evil gods, or evil powers was Apophis, who was represented by a snake. Apophis was the serpent of darkness, the supreme opponent of the great sun god Ra. So you see, this is part of the reason why Yahweh has them create a bronze serpent to stick it on a pole to show them that those gods aren't real. I am the one true God, the creator of the universe. If you want to look upon a snake, you're going to look upon the one that I'm going to have Moshe create. And that's going to be the one that gives you life. It isn't any of these other gods. Okay. Now remember, in the ancient world, you have honor and shame that is such a huge factor. We've talked about this for the last few years. And we're going to implement that a lot more into some of the upcoming teachings that we do. But honor and shame is such a huge deal in the ancient world in the 1st century. And one of the ways that a king would gain honor for himself was by conquering other kings. Okay? Now remember, when Yahweh is basically going against all of the Egyptian gods with the 10 plagues, he is acquiring honor for himself in the eyes of not only the Israelites, but also in the midst of the Egyptian people and in the midst of everybody that is in Mesopotamia. Okay? And the reason why I say that is because, remember, when they finally get through the whole wilderness experience, and they get into the Promised Land, they cross the Jordan, they do all these things, and they go into Jericho, they meet Rahab, and what is the very first thing that she says? Does anybody remember? Yes. The dread of your God has fallen upon us and fallen upon all of our people. We've heard about all of these things that your God has done, and she basically makes a proclamation right there and says that your God is the God of heaven above, or the universe above, and of the earth below. We do not realize the importance and the severity of what she just said. The very first person they encounter when they cross the Jordan makes a declaration that Yahweh, this is a citizen of the land at the time, of Canaan. She makes a declaration that Yahweh is the God of all things above and all things below. That's extremely huge. But see, the honor of Yahweh has gone all the way across the land of the wilderness and Mesopotamia and all the way into Israel by the citizens. So they're hearing and they're seeing. If you don't think these other nations had spies spying out the Israelites, then you're incorrect. I mean, these are kingdoms. I mean, they have CIA type of agents and agencies and all these different reconnaissance missions. And I mean, it's just like we are today. So they're watching they're hearing stories of their gods doing these things in fairy tales and fables, but now they're seeing that there's a God out there that's actually doing them. Just let's take, it says in Scripture, and one of the Psalms, I can't remember which one it is, it says that Yahweh is the cloud rider. He is the rider of the clouds and all this stuff, and he shows up in the pillar of cloud and all that stuff. Do you know where that comes from? Why he uses that terminology? It's because Baal was known as the rider of the clouds. He was a storm god all across Mesopotamia. So he's using the same language to show these people in this book that those gods that you think are gods, you've been hearing all these stories and fables, and all, they're not even gods. But now they're witnessing a God and the creator of the universe that's actually attached to these same similar elements. So now they're going to give honor to him, which is just going to gain him more honor in order for him to get more people to come into covenant with him. Okay? So, this is why I'm giving you a little bit of this terminology and context to how these people believe. Now, the word used for serpent in Numbers 21:9 is the word nachash. Okay? It just basically means a snake or a serpent. This is the same word to describe the serpent or Hasatan in Genesis 3. Okay? So, serpent in Genesis 3, death. Serpent in Genesis 21 verse 9, life. Dual symbolism. I really wish Bob was here. I was supposed to call Bob this week, and I didn't get a chance to call Bob. If none of you know who Bob Bowman is, Bob is a gematria guy. I mean, the guy just loves gematria. Sometimes he just loves gematria. But I found this really, really interesting to show you, just to keep adding upon the context of the dual symbolism. The gematria, or numeric value, if some of you don't know what gematria is they take each letter of the Hebrew alphabet and in Hebrew words, they give it a numerical value, and they build a meaning, a phrase, or a context, and it's really, really fascinating. I mean, it's not my gig to study it all the time. I deal with math every single day of my life at work, so I don't really want to mess with it. But some people, that's their thing. So the value for both Mashiach, or Messiah, and Nachash, or serpent, is the number 358. And most of you know by now, if you want the PowerPoint, email me, and I give it to you. Don't frantically write down notes like I'm going to turn the slide too far. So you have dynamic opposites with, obviously, Hasatan and Yeshua. One represents life, one represents death. And the same gematria, numerical value to those words, those Hebrew words, is 358. Okay. So now you can see why Yahweh is using a little bit of the bronze, or the snake, and the pole, and all that kind of stuff, because Egypt was so familiar with these type of things. We're going to get into, in my opinion, the most important part, the most important connection, linking this to Yeshua on why they were supposed to do this, because it was a shadow picture of Yeshua. Okay, and if some of you haven't heard the world messenger stuff that I talk about, I mean, I'm going to incorporate that in a lot of stuff that we talk about, but the royal messenger and the proclamation of freedom that the royal messenger would bring is absolutely essential for us to understand so many different things. And this is one of them. Signs of liberation. These proclamations of liberation were accompanied by special signs. And before I get into that, the royal messenger, so you have a king that rises to power. Let's just talk about that real quick. When kings would rise to power, they would conquer other lands, right? They'd move on to their throne, they'd do all these things, and then they would make all these promises and promises and promises, and do all of these great things, or say they were going to do all of these great things for their people. Okay, it's just like today when you have a president that's running for the presidency, they promise the world, you don't hear from any of these politicians from Congress, the Senate, representative, any of them, until it's time for them to, you want to say something? Until they start running for office, right? And then you start hearing everything from them. They promise you the world just to get you to vote for them. The ancient world, it wasn't really like that. They didn't have democracy or any of that thing. But they still made promises that they never kept. You know, they would do a few things here and there. Like the Assyrians, when an Assyrian nation or king would conquer another nation, all of their treaties, there was no blessings. There was nothing but cursing. So if you did this, you broke this, you broke this, you broke this, you died. They beat you, then you died, they beat you, then you died. There was no blessings in hardly any of the Assyrian treaties. The Hittites and some of these other nations, they had blessings incorporated into their covenants. But anyway, when the kings would rise to power, they would make all these proclamations of freedom and say, okay, now that we've taken over, we're going to set the slaves free, or we're going to do a better job of taking care of the widows and the orphans and all that stuff along those lines, right? Returning people's inheritance, their land, their property. And what they would do is they would send out a messenger that represented that king to make these proclamations, okay? They would go all throughout the land telling them that, you know, the king has risen to power and done all of these things, and now you have been set free. And this is basically what Yeshua is. Yahweh is doing the same thing, and I'm going to make those connections a little bit later. But there was actually, this proclamation of freedom was done one of two ways. The first one is they would send a letter out. Okay? So the king would rise to power, or he would already be in power and decide he's going to free people. So he would send out a letter with his royal messenger, and that message, that letter, was meant to be heard inside the land in which the people could hear it. If you look up the book of Ezra, the very first chapter, this is exactly what King Cyrus did. Is he wrote this letter freeing the Jews to go back to their homeland, to rebuild their temple. They have their inheritance back. They do all these things. So there's all these connections of methods on how they would do things to get the message of freedom. Okay, this is exactly what John the Immerser is doing. He's being this royal messenger out in the wilderness, proclaiming that Yahweh is sending Yeshua to be this means of liberation, this means of freedom, and all this other sort of things. Right. So when these messages would go out, there was specific signs that went with them. There were signs. And this is what this slide is talking about. And it says that there were special signs given to the people to signal the coming of freedom. It was customary in Israel to blow the shofar at the beginning of the year of liberation, or the Jubilee, the Shemitah. So that over the course of time, the blowing of the shofar became a symbol of freedom and liberation. So there was this outward sign, this outward expression that people understood exactly what it meant to know that freedom has been granted in some sort of manner. Okay, does it make sense so far? Isaiah 27:13, the benediction of the Jewish daily prayer. Blow the great shofar for our freedom, which is placed next to the benediction of the establishment of the reign of righteousness and justice. Similarly, it was customary in Mesopotamia to lift a torch as a sign of the proclamation of freedom. So they would go into the Mesopotamians, they would light a torch, and they would light this torch so that then people would know that there was some sort of liberation that was being given to the people. This is huge. Proclamation of freedom, while in the permanent act of liberation as distinguished from a one-time release, a pole was placed next to the gate of the city to which the rights of freedom had been given. Kadinu, or next to the border of the territory, which had been exempted from the levies and taxes in Egypt, where it's customary. Anyway, I don't want you to read the rest of it. So basically, when you see that word Kadinu or Kuduru, that's an Akkadian word. I can go ahead and take the snake off now. But this word Kuduru is basically a boundary stone. So they had all these boundary stones that would establish the borders of their lands, right? Well, on those, this is not coming off. So on those stones, they would set these stones up as border stones, and they would basically outline their boundaries. And so they knew where their land was and where somebody else's land was. But as soon as you crossed into somebody else's land and you found one of these stones or one of these poles, so the stones, they actually had the covenant was written on those stones. Okay, so it's a grant that was chiseled onto these stones saying that this land was given to these people by this God, this land was given to these people by this God. And it's the same thing with Israel. Israel has all these boundary stones that they set up, I mean, immediately as soon as they start crossing the Jordan, right? So back to the pole and the torch. King would rise to power, he'd light this torch, and then somebody would either walk around with this torch, letting them know and telling them, proclaiming what freedom was given to them, what liberation has been given them. These slaves are set free, your inheritance has been given back. Or they would set it somewhere. Others, like the Hittites and some of these other people, they would have a pole. And they'd take this pole and they would set it right outside the city gate. And every single person that lived within those borders knew exactly what this pole meant. This pole would be right outside the city gate. Why would it be right outside the city gate? Anybody know? What was the city gate for? How many are going for what else? Business. Court cases. All of your major court cases of the ancient Near East were done in a town square right by the gate, and so on and so forth. That's where judges sat. I mean, you can see this all throughout the Bible. So this is these are the signs that people would know that they've been some sort of liberation has come to them. I said, if you go back and you look at the book of Ezra, this is exactly what has happened with the letter, the voice going out proclaiming all of this freedom, right? So social justice in ancient Israel and in the ancient Near East. How many of you remember us doing this video course on the Wisdom of Torah website? Anybody here? Basically what we did is we went through this book chapter by chapter and hopefully in a manner in which we did correctly is show people the exact meanings of justice and righteousness. We've talked a lot about this since we started HFF, is that social justice and righteousness in the eyes of Yahweh is not just about us keeping commandments. Okay? It's not about just keeping commandments. If we're going to just keep commandments and check everything off the list, and we're going to go out that door and we're going to see somebody who's hungry or naked or anything like that and just walk by and say, I'm just going to pray for you, you might as well stop keeping commandments. I mean, because this is exactly what Israel did all throughout Scripture. You know, this is the huge problem that was going on in the first century. They kept commandments, they kept additional commandments and more commandments, but they neglected to take care of the people that they were supposed to take care of within the kingdom. This is where justice, true context of justice and righteousness comes in, is that it goes beyond you keeping the commandments of the treaty with the king. You have to have the character of the king in which you serve. Remember when I'm going to say this from now until he comes back. Keeping commandments is easy. It is so easy for all of us to walk in the door, sit down and say we're keeping Shabbat. It's simple. Granted, we may not all keep Shabbat on the same day. We might not do this on the same day. But it's really easy to keep feasts. It's really easy to keep kosher. All of that stuff is pretty simple. It really is. But when you start, being convicted of a lot of other things, that's because Yahweh is shaping you and I to have the character that He has. That's the bottom line. Keeping commandments and keeping Torah is absolutely essential, yes. But if that's all we're going to do, we might as well stop. That's the bottom line. It has to be more than that. So this whole topic of what's going on with the poll is directly linked to righteousness and justice, of Yahweh doing everything He can to establish His people again and to restore all of creation by the chaos that we caused. Okay? He doesn't care if we just keep His commandments. I mean, He wants you to love Him, He wants me to love Him, but there's more to it than that. And we've got to be able to do these same things for other people because why? Because He's chosen us, for whatever reason, right now in this point in time, to be a witness to those that are around us. And you and I are to be those world messengers, those agents of the kingdom, to help show people how they can be a part of this kingdom. So anyway, this whole deal from this book, if you don't have this book, I highly, highly recommend it. If you email me, I can send you a PDF. But you can't tell anybody that I did it. We're going to have to edit that part out of the video. So anyway, the raising of a torch or of a pole also served in Israel as widespread means of communication. Jeremiah 4, you can read the verses later. In certain scriptures, the pole serves as a symbol of freedom, its function being to inform captives, exiles, and imprisoned people of their liberation. Let me read that again. The pole serves as a symbol of freedom, its function being to inform captives, exiles, and imprisoned people of their liberation and return to their homes or their land. Indeed, the primary purpose of freedom is the restoration of the individual to his home and to his inheritance. Hopefully you're starting to make connections. I'm going to read that last verse, that last sentence again. Indeed, the primary purpose of freedom is the restoration of the individual to his home and to his inheritance. The Sumerian term for freedom, I don't need to read any of that stuff. Freedom, in the broad sense of the word, incorporates the following elements: the freeing of slaves and of debtors from their debts, pardon to prisoners and rebels, the release of captives, the return of exiles to their homeland, annulment of taxes, the restoration of estates to families, and the division of the land to the needy. Remember, Israel wasn't the only one that did this. It was also done by the Hittites, the Mesopotamians. All these other nations had their own symbols, their own signs that did all of these things for the people. Now, whether or not the kings carried them out, they pretty much didn't most of the time. So we have to keep that in mind. So Yahweh's using something that they understand to show the distinction between them and who He is. Now let's jump to John chapter 3, verses 10 through 21, which is actually, if you have David Stern's Bible, I don't know about any of the other Torah portion schedules or any of that stuff, but this is one of the verses that we read for the New Testament portion this week, because it's all connected. So John 3, 10 through 21. Yeshua answered and said to him, "Are you the teacher of Israel, and do not know this? Truly, truly, I say to you, we speak what we know and witness what we have seen, and you do not receive our witness. If you do not believe when I spoke about earthly matters, how are you going to believe when I speak to you about the heavenly matters?" You see, everything that Israel is going through, throughout the wilderness, throughout the Torah, throughout this life, It always, always, always is going to point to a heavenly issue, a heavenly matter that is attached to Yeshua. I really don't understand why people have issues with who Yeshua is. I just don't understand. To me, it just seems like it's concrete. And the more and more that we go through the Torah cycle, and we go through the Brit Hadashah readings, and that's one thing that my family has done since day one we came into Torah. I know a lot of people in this movement, we just focus on the Torah, the Torah, the Torah, the Torah, the Torah. We throw the baby out with the bathwater. But you can't do that. You cannot do that and then expect your relationship with Messiah to grow. Verse 13, and no one has gone up into heaven except he who came down from heaven, and the Son of Adam.